3 sentences. That was all it took to make me question whether the last 9 years of my life had been built on borrowed time. A plain white envelope from the Pine Hollow Community Association told me I had 30 days to shut down the private well that had supplied my property for nearly a decade, pay a $1,200 connection fee, and permanently hook my home into the HOA's water system. The funny part is that before those 30 days were even over, the same board that threatened me ended up paying me $2,000 every single month just to keep that well running. My name is Daniel Mercer, and if you have ever met the kind of people who think a clipboard somehow gives them the authority to rewrite history, you'll probably understand exactly why I didn't panic the moment I opened that letter. I live outside a small town in western Tennessee, on a piece of land my grandfather bought long before anyone ever dreamed of building a gated subdivision around it. My house sits on the highest hill in the neighborhood, surrounded by old maple trees, a vegetable garden that keeps getting bigger because my wife Claire can't stop planting tomatoes every spring, a detached workshop where I restore antique tractors on weekends, and a private well that has quietly done its job without asking anyone for permission. For 9 years, nobody from the association had ever mentioned it. They inspected my fence, complained once about my mailbox color, even argued over the size of my American flag, but never once did anyone say a word about the well. Then a new board was elected. Funny how things change when people start confusing power with importance. The new president was a woman named Denise Halbrook. She had this habit of smiling while delivering bad news, like she genuinely believed that wrapping something ugly in politeness somehow made it reasonable. Her vice president, Carl Whitman, barely spoke unless he thought someone needed reminding that the rules were the rules. Together, they had spent the better part of 6 months looking for violations nobody else cared about. My letter was just another trophy on their wall. It didn't explain why my well had suddenly become unacceptable. It simply declared that every residence was required to connect to the association's approved infrastructure, and that failure to comply could result in escalating fines and legal action. No appeal process. No explanation. Just 30 days. Claire read it twice before looking over at me. "You're awfully calm," she said. I shrugged and poured another cup of coffee. "Because something doesn't smell right," she laughed. "Besides Carl's attitude?" "Exactly besides Carl's attitude." I spent that evening walking out to the well house, listening to the familiar hum of the pump. It's funny how you never really notice ordinary things until someone threatens to take them away. That pump had watered our garden through droughts, filled stock tanks when we still had goats, and supplied every inch of the property without costing anyone else a dime. Looking at it, I couldn't shake one question. If this had truly been against the rules, why had they waited almost a decade? A week later, I attended the monthly HOA meeting. The room was packed because Denise had recently proposed raising annual dues, and nobody seemed thrilled about it. When public comments opened, I stood up holding nothing more than my violation notice. Could someone point me to the exact rule that says my well has to be disconnected? The room got quiet. Denise looked toward Carl. Carl flipped through a thick binder like he had rehearsed the moment in front of a mirror. Finally, he found a page, adjusted his glasses, and read aloud that all residential structures shall rely on association-approved water infrastructure. Then, he looked directly at me with the kind of grin that only appears when someone thinks they've already won. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you've actually been out of compliance since the day you moved in." A couple people nodded. Others looked confused. I asked one more question. "Was this ever brought up during any inspection over the last 9 years?" Denise answered before Carl could. "Oversights happen. The board is correcting them now." There it was. Oversights happen. 9 years of silence suddenly became an oversight. I thanked them, sat down, and listened through the rest of the meeting without saying another word. As people filtered toward the parking lot, one of my neighbors, an older retired firefighter named Hank Lawson, caught up with me. "Danny," he said quietly, "they're pushing harder than usual lately. You thinking about fighting this?" I smiled. "I'm thinking about figuring out why now." Hank chuckled. "That's probably a better question. Most people would have hired a lawyer the next morning. Some would have gone online and started complaining. Others would have paid the fee just to make the problem disappear. Instead, I drove home, spread every document I owned across the dining room table, and started reading. Property records, survey maps, building permits, county filings, old correspondence. My grandfather used to say that land always remembers the truth even when people don't. And somewhere around midnight, I started wondering if maybe the truth had been sitting in those records all along, just waiting for somebody patient enough to look for it. 4 days later, I made a phone call that changed everything. The woman at the county water resources office probably thought she was answering another routine question when she picked up the phone. I introduced myself, gave her my parcel number, and asked if she could tell me when my well had first been registered. I expected a simple date, maybe a permit number if I was lucky. Instead, there was a long pause, the sound of a keyboard clicking, and then she said something that immediately made me sit up straighter. "Mr. Mercer, your agricultural water registration predates the subdivision." I asked her to repeat it because I honestly thought I'd misheard. "Your water rights were recorded in 1997. The Homeowners Association wasn't incorporated until 2000, unless something changed in the deed. Those rights stay attached to the property." I thanked her, hung up, and just stared out the kitchen window for a full minute. Claire walked in carrying groceries and immediately knew something had changed. "Good news?" she asked. I looked over with the biggest grin I'd had all week. Let's just say somebody skipped an important chapter before writing me that violation. That afternoon, I drove to the county office in person. I wanted copies of everything, not because I didn't trust the woman on the phone, but because I'd learned over the years that paperwork wins arguments long before emotions ever do. An older survey technician named Michael Ruiz met me in the records room. He had worked there for nearly 30 years and had the kind of memory that makes old government employees priceless. As soon as he saw the legal description on my property, he laughed quietly. "Mercer Hill," he said. "I remember your grandfather arguing with developers back in the 90s. He refused to sell the top of that ridge." I smiled. "Sounds like him." Michael pulled out old plats, utility drawings, engineering submissions from the original subdivision application, and one faded map that immediately caught my eye. My property wasn't simply next to the subdivision, it sat above it, much higher. Michael traced a finger across the elevation lines before looking at me. "You know what's interesting? Their original pressure calculations assumed your parcel would remain off their municipal line." I frowned. "Meaning?" He leaned back in his chair. "Meaning they designed the entire distribution system expecting your well to remain active." I blinked. "You're telling me they planned around my private water supply?" "Looks that way." Suddenly, that ridiculous violation letter wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. If I connected to the HOA system the way they demanded, their entire hydraulic model would change. Michael suggested I contact the county engineer because he wanted someone else to verify the numbers. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from engineer Laura Benson, while she spread blueprints across a conference table. She didn't work for the HOA. She worked for the county, which meant she had no reason to protect anyone's ego. She studied the drawings, compared them with updated infrastructure reports, then quietly circled 6 addresses downhill from my property. "These homes already experience marginal pressure during peak demand," she explained. "If your residence starts pulling from the same line, you'll probably see pressure drops below minimum standards." "Probably?" I asked. She looked at me with the calm confidence of someone who had done this for decades. "No. Actually, I'm comfortable saying almost certainly." Then she said something I never expected. "Whoever sent you this violation either doesn't understand how their own system works, or they never bothered checking." I couldn't stop laughing after I walked back to my truck. Not because the situation was funny, but because it had reached the point where reality had become absurd. The board had spent weeks trying to force me into doing the one thing their own infrastructure couldn't afford. That evening, Claire found me making copies of every document I'd collected. "You look dangerous," she joked. "No," I answered, prepared. Instead of storming into another board meeting, I called attorney Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca wasn't flashy. She didn't threaten lawsuits during the first conversation or promise dramatic courtroom victories. She simply listened while I explained everything from the violation notice to the county engineer's findings. When I finished, she asked one question. "Do you want revenge? Or do you want this solved?" I didn't even hesitate. "Solved." "Good," she replied, "because revenge usually costs more." She drafted a letter that was polite enough to sound professional, but firm enough to remove every ounce of confidence from anyone reading it. It explained that my agricultural water rights were protected under state law, that the HOA lacked legal authority to force abandonment of the well, and that any deficiencies in the association's water infrastructure remained solely the responsibility of the association. She attached copies of county records, engineering findings, and registration documents. Then she mailed it by certified delivery. We expected an argument. We expected another violation notice. We expected threats about court. Instead, nothing. 1 week passed. Silence. 2 weeks. Still nothing. Denise stopped answering emails altogether. Carl canceled the next architectural committee meeting for reasons nobody understood. Around the neighborhood, people started asking questions. Hank knocked on my workshop door one Saturday morning while I was rebuilding the carburetor on an old Ford tractor. "You notice something?" he asked. "Besides you interrupting my masterpiece," he laughed. "The board hasn't sent out a violation in almost 3 weeks. That caught my attention. Pine Hollow had become notorious for violation letters. Somebody left a trash can visible for an extra day. They got a notice. Someone parked a trailer overnight. Another notice. Suddenly everything had stopped. It wasn't until the following Tuesday that I understood why. Denise herself called my cell phone. Her voice sounded completely different from the woman who had confidently announced at the meeting that I had been violating policy for 9 years. There was no rehearsed authority, no polished confidence, just hesitation. "Mr. Mercer? I was hoping we could meet privately." I almost smiled before answering. "About what?" "There are some infrastructure concerns we'd like to discuss." I looked over at Claire, who was pretending not to eavesdrop while absolutely eavesdropping. "Infrastructure concerns?" I repeated. "Yes. The same infrastructure that required me to destroy my well?" Another long pause. This conversation might be easier in person. We agreed to meet at the clubhouse 2 days later. When I walked into the conference room, every board member was already sitting there. Denise, Carl, the treasurer, even the association's engineering consultant had shown up carrying rolled blueprints. Nobody smiled this time. Carl wouldn't even make eye contact. Denise folded her hands together before speaking. "Mr. Mercer." After reviewing additional engineering information, I couldn't help myself. Interesting phrase. Additional engineering information. She ignored the comment. "It appears your well contributes indirectly to pressure stability throughout the western section of the neighborhood." I leaned back. So the county engineer was right. Nobody answered. The consultant finally cleared his throat. "Your property's elevation effectively reduces demand on the municipal line. Connecting your residence would require significant upgrades to maintain acceptable pressure." "How significant?" I asked. He shifted uncomfortably before admitting. "Potentially several $100,000. There it was, finally spoken out loud. They hadn't targeted my well because it violated anything. They targeted it because they assumed I'd quietly comply without anyone discovering that doing so would expose an expensive engineering mistake buried inside the subdivision's original design. Denise took a slow breath. "The board would like to explore alternative solutions." I folded my arms. Now we're finally having an honest conversation. She slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a proposal unlike anything I expected. I read the first page once, then read it again just to make sure I wasn't imagining what was sitting in front of me. The proposal offered something I never imagined I'd see from the same people who had threatened me less than a month earlier. The Pine Hollow Community Association wanted permission to install a pressure balancing connection at my wellhead, allowing them to stabilize water pressure for the 6 homes below my property whenever demand peaked. In exchange, they were offering a monthly payment of $2,000, full responsibility for installation and maintenance on their side of the connection, and a private contract that I could terminate with 60 days written notice. I looked up from the paperwork and couldn't help smiling. Denise noticed immediately. "Is something amusing?" she asked. I nodded, just remembering that according to your letter, this well was apparently a problem. Nobody laughed. The room stayed painfully quiet until Rebecca, my attorney, who had joined me for the meeting, finally spoke. "Before my client responds, let's make one thing absolutely clear. Mr. Mercer is under no legal obligation to sign anything today, tomorrow, or ever." Denise nodded quickly. "We understand." Carl finally looked up from the table for the first time that afternoon. He looked exhausted. Nothing like the competent man who had proudly read that policy aloud at the board meeting weeks earlier. "We're trying to find a practical solution," he muttered. I looked directly at him. Funny. I thought the practical solution was tearing out my well. His face turned bright red, but he didn't answer. Instead, the engineering consultant quietly admitted what everyone in that room already knew. Rebuilding the western pressure zone would require a new booster station, upgraded mains, excavation under 2 streets, environmental permits, and months of construction. The estimated cost had climbed to nearly $400,000 before labor inflation was even considered. Compared to that, paying me $2,000 each month wasn't just cheaper. It was the only financially responsible option they had left. Rebecca leaned toward me and whispered, "You have all the leverage. Don't rush." She was right. For the first time since that ridiculous violation notice arrived, I wasn't reacting anymore. They were. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'm not selling the well." Denise shook her head immediately. "We aren't asking you to. I'm not transferring ownership." "Understood. You don't get unrestricted access to my property. Reasonable?" "The connection point stays outside my fenced equipment area. Every worker entering my land schedules with me in advance except during emergencies. Your insurance covers every possible liability. And if this agreement ever interferes with my own water supply, I shut it off immediately until the issue was corrected." The consultant started writing notes as fast as he could. Rebecca added another condition. "The agreement also needs language acknowledging Mr. Mercer's existing water rights and confirming that this contract creates no future ownership interest in his well or associated infrastructure." Denise didn't even argue. "We'll include it." That surprised me more than anything else. A month earlier, they had acted like I was some stubborn homeowner refusing to follow simple rules. Now they weren't negotiating from strength. They were negotiating from necessity. We spent another hour refining details until every concern had been addressed. When the final draft arrived the following week, Rebecca reviewed every paragraph twice before giving me a simple nod. "If you're comfortable," she said, "I'd sign this." So I did. Installation took less than 3 days. The HOA's contractor installed a metered balancing connection exactly where we agreed, restored every inch of disturbed landscaping, and even reseeded the grass before leaving. The irony wasn't lost on my neighbors. The same association that had ordered me to remove my well was now carefully protecting it because their own neighborhood depended on it. The first monthly check arrived 8 days later, still well before the original 30-day deadline, and the violation notice had expired. Claire held the envelope in one hand and the old violation letter in the other before bursting into laughter. "We should frame these together," she said. "One says your well has to disappear. The other literally pays you because it exists." Hank came over that weekend carrying barbecue and a six-pack. He looked at the new connection beside the well house, shook his head, and laughed so hard he almost dropped his plate. "Danny," he said, "I don't think I've ever seen an HOA fine somebody into becoming their contractor." "Neither have I," I answered. Life settled back into normal after that. The garden kept growing. The workshop stayed busy. And every month another check showed up exactly on schedule. The pump sounded exactly the same as it always had. It hadn't become louder or faster or more impressive. The only thing that changed was the way people looked at it. What had once been labeled a violation had become one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure in the neighborhood. Looking back, I don't think the biggest lesson was about water rights or engineering reports. It was about something much simpler. Authority sounds convincing until it runs into facts. Denise and Carl weren't evil people. They were people who became so convinced they were right that they stopped asking whether they actually were. They trusted a binder more than history, assumptions more than records, and confidence more than evidence. If I had simply obeyed that letter because it carried an official logo, 6 families would have ended up with worse water service. The association would have spent hundreds of thousands fixing a problem they created, and I would have lost a perfectly legal well for absolutely no reason. Instead, one phone call, a few public records, and the willingness to ask one simple question completely changed the outcome. So now I'm curious about something. If you were in my position, would you have signed the agreement and accepted the monthly payments? Or would you have refused out of principle and forced the HOA to spend hundreds of thousands rebuilding their own system? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments, because I can already imagine people arguing both sides of that one. And if you've ever had an HOA, a city office, or any organization tell you something was against the rules, only for you to discover the rules never actually applied in the first place, share your story below. I read as many of those comments as I can, and some of the real experiences people share are even more unbelievable than mine. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stand your ground when the facts are on your side, and remember that sometimes the quietest victory is simply letting the truth do all the talking.